All right, we are in Ephesians chapter 6, verses 10 through 20. This is one of the probably one of the more famous pieces of Ephesians. It's quoted a lot, especially in men's Bible study groups. This is ironically the fourth time I've done this study with CC. This is not the same study I did the first time. This actually totally rewrote it this time. So yeah, it's a relatively common chapter. Part of it is because I think it resonates well with men. Part of it is because it also is in Ephesians, which is basically Cliff Notes version of Romans, which is kind of nice because we know that Romans needs Cliff Notes from the year-long study we just concluded in Romans. um, he's here. All hail the scribe.
I'm not teaching. Why are you guys waiting on me?
We weren't.
I was just announcing you're coming.
Oh, okay. Just amusing me. Yeah, you guys are waiting on me. Anyways, carry on. Sorry to interrupt.
We were just going on without you.
Just keeping the meme going, Wayne. Just keeping the meme going.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so so that's it's a well-known piece of a well-known book. So very good stuff for us to go over, and I think there's some things that in classic CC way that by setting the context correctly, we can pull out some things that are not often highlighted from this, and frankly, I'd say a lot of studies just get wrong about this section. So
this is a trick question. I don't want to answer.
Did you have a trick question?
No, I was preempting your trick question. You were about to spring on us.
Oh, copy. I do actually have some tonight. So can I have a volunteer? This is not one of them, though. Can I have a volunteer to read Ephesians 6, verses 10 through 20, and then we'll just go through piece by piece.
I can.
Go for it.
Finally, be strong in the Lord of his might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. We do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against rulers, against authorities, against the cosmic powers, and over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand firm. Stand therefore, having fastened on the belt of truth, and having put on the breastplate of righteousness, and as shoes for your feet, having put on the readiness given by the gospel of peace. In all circumstances, take up the shield of faith, with which you can extinguish all the flaming darts of the evil one, and take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God, praying at all times in the Spirit, with prayer and supplication. To that end, keep alert with all perseverance, making supplication for all the saints, and also for me, that words may be given to me in opening my mouth boldly to proclaim the mystery of the gospel, for which I am an ambassador in chains, that I may declare it boldly, as I ought to speak.
Thank you. All right. Verse 10. Be strong in the Lord and the power of his might. So first thing, because we're about to talk about a struggle. Imagine that, talking about a struggle in Ephesians. Would never have thought about that. We're about to talk about a struggle. We're supposed to remember where our strength comes from. Our strength that empowers us to endure and triumph in the struggle comes from the Lord. 3 words occur here. One of them is the word for power. What's the Greek word for power?
Is it a different word than dunamis this time, or they just have one word in Greek?
Nope, it's dunamis.
Die, beat me to
it. Does that word sound like a similar word in the English language?
I know this one.
Kaboom!
Dynamite.
Yep,
It's actually the same. That's where we get the word.
It is, exactly. Yep. Had to give you guys a softball to warm you up a little bit. Okay, good. Yeah, no, that's exactly it. So, that's exactly where we get the word dynamite from. Yep. Excellent. So, the word for might is a word we also know. Anybody know what that word is?
What word?
The word for might, Greek word for might.
I'm pulling up Bible Hub.
If you scroll through Discord, you might find it. This one comes with a tip. Hint.
Is it Kratos?
It is.
Yes.
Yeah, crap toast. Yeah. No, it's Kratos. Yeah, it is. Yeah. So that's the word for might there. This verse kind of references, I think, Zechariah 4:6, which is not by strength or by might, but by my spirit, the Lord God of hosts. So, reminding us that the strength, the might that we need for this coming struggle comes from God. It's been given to us. We're not relying upon ourselves. All right. So finally, be strong in the Lord in the strength of His might. Put on the whole armor of God, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. The whole armor of God. Okay. So armor of God. Interesting turn of phrase. Means God's armor. The Romans were kind of unique in that they were one of the first armies where the commanders of the army actually issued his troops equipment and armor. Most of the time, you were required for providing your own weapons of war when you enrolled in the army. The Romans changed it under the reforms under Marius, about 100 years before this was written, a little over 100 years. But when we look at the Roman legions, and we see in the history books, they all kind of look the same. Part of that's because it's cheaper if everybody's buying a bunch of reproduction armor. Part of it is because that's actually a decent. It was one of the first times a lot of the equipment was standardized. So uh, the general would actually buy the equipment for his men, kind of have them all outfitted in the same way. A lot of times there would be some differences from region to region or from commander to commander, but yeah, it was one of the first times where the troops were actually issued equipment, issued armor. So the armor that we're given, again, is not our own. We're not bringing this to the fight on our own. By our commander, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. Stand, we'll see this word repeated here several times, connotes strength, resistance, struggle. In the ancient time, it was the most dangerous thing for an army was for its will to break and its men to run. Morale broke a long time before everybody got killed. The men were trained to stand and face the enemy barrage because if they ran, it endangered them and the people on either side of them because of the way that the battle lines worked. The vast majority of the casualties in ancient warfare took place not during the fighting, but when one side turned and ran. So a lot of the training was about endurance training and having people continue to stand on the battle line and push and hold their ground. Because of the danger of running. In fact, some sources say that up to 90% of the casualties in the killing took place during the retreat. That's probably a little bit high, but conservative estimates from like West Point textbooks and stuff will say around 70 to 80%, which is still an incredibly high number. So again, the training that the Romans got was about how to stand up in the face of enemy barrage and never turn your back and run, but to continue to withstand the projectile fire that you were taking, and then to withstand enemy rushes as well. Interesting to note, the imperatives in this entire section, so the commands, are given in a plural conjugation of the verbs. So when we're told to do this, I think a lot of times in the church we think of this as kind of an individual thing. Oh, I'm going to put on my armor so I can stand up against the devil. Nope. The armor that was, we'll talk more about this later, but the armor that is mentioned here is designed to be fought with on a battle line. So get kind of the Middle Ages imagery of like a armored knight out of your head, because it's both dangerous. Classical era combat, which we're dealing with from about 500 BC up to 400 AD. Classical era combat was heavy infantry drawn upon what region you're from. The Greeks used a phalanx. The Romans used an armature system, which they switched over to more. But basically, lines of soldiers standing side by side in blocks, which would then the block would move as one unit around the battlefield. And when you would encounter enemy archers, everybody would raise their shields from testudo, kind of protect themselves and each other from the arrows. So the Spartans, who fought in a phalanx, which is similar to a Roman system, but Roman system was more flexible. You could move it around the battlefield better. But the Spartans had a saying. The Spartan women would actually tell their husbands and their sons when they went off to battle, "Come back with your shield or on it." Which seems a little harsh, but the reason for that was your shield was there not just to protect you, but to protect the guy next to you too. And if you dropped your shield, you weren't just endangering yourself, you were endangering the people around you. So again, the group combat is a group sport. So it's a team sport, group activity during this time. So when we read these imperatives, then we keep that in mind. So put on the whole armor of God against a group imperative, that you may be able to stand against the schemes of the devil. Other translations translate this differently. Wiles, strategies, traps. What Satan's been doing since the Garden of Eden is what's being talked about here. Stratagems, trickery, ways to trip us up, to get us to either flee the field or attempt to fight against God's purpose by trying to be our own God, by not following His commands, by not helping those around us, but by trying to be our own God. Ye shall be as gods, as the old temptation goes. So, be able to stand up against that and resist that, we need to put on the whole armor. Against flesh and blood, but against rulers, against authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. What does that mean?
So I think something I've never heard mentioned in this study is where I forget if it's Jesus or Paul who says this, but it's that if you have a conflict with your brother, to make peace with them. So I think this was probably something. Well, I'm not even bold enough to say probably, but this may have been meant as like an additional supplement to that is to realize you're not at war with them. There's something bigger and spiritual going on.
I think that's a very good interpretation. Absolutely. Go ahead, Cass.
I was going to say it means that the people who are causing us harm are not the primary source of the harm.
Yeah, exactly. Josh is right. This gives the power to forgive, right? I mean, because we can realize that we're not fighting against people. We're not fighting against government officials. We're not fighting against, Roman soldiers. We're not fighting against the uh, the people that we see. We're fighting against what's behind them, right? Fighting against spiritual powers. We're fighting against the power of darkness, that Satan's power to deceive those around us and lead people away from God. Fighting against that. Some people have tried to talk about different levels of demons and spiritual powers from this. That's totally out of context and reading too much into this. But basically, you guys have the correct idea that this is not this war that we're talking about. These weapons we're talking about are not physical weapons, but are instead spiritual weapons, waging the battle for hearts and minds, as the saying goes. But because of that, these trials that we have, these conflicts that we have with the brothers around us, brothers and sisters around us, we should do everything we can to put those away, because something bigger going on, something deeper. Good. The word for struggle there, for we wrestle, or rather the word for wrestle, is the only place in the New Testament that word appears. It's a kind of a wrestling term. So, tidbit of trivia knowledge there for you. All right, verse 13. Therefore, take up the whole armor of God, that you may be able to withstand the evil day, and having done all, to stand firm. So again, the emphasis on standing firm, standing fast, something that would be familiar to people who understood how fighting works at the time. Verse 14, in case you forgot from the last 3 verses, stand therefore, that keeps me up, having fastened on the belt of truth, and having put on the breastplate of righteousness. Okay, so belt of truth. What's being talked about here? Truth. Is this the truth of the gospel or integrity, that sort of truth? What kind of truth is being talked about?
I'm going to go with the Sunday school answer and say neither. That's a trick question. The truth is Jesus, because Jesus said he's the truth.
Okay. 6 is safe route. Go ahead, Cass.
I'll still mute. Why can't it be both?
Why can't it be both? Good question.
Man, it's like I can't even call Ongarth out on his trick questions anymore. You guys are on it faster than I get to it.
Did you have anything you wanted to add, Wingen?
Nah, Kessa's just like, I'm gonna take Scribe's place. You can just sit there and just chill on this one. I got all his answers, so cool. Read my notes again.
I just reject the question.
That's exactly it.
That's pretty much it. Either the answer is both, or why are you asking this question?
Because it's like both, and Priest is like neither. Jesus. I can't get away with trick questions anymore, man. We'll see what we can do. No, you guys are right. Actually, there's a lot of debate about this in commentaries, because again, people who get paid to argue fine points will argue fine points to the nth degree. I think it's all about motivation. It's I do think it's largely both. I think integrity is a big part of it. And here's my reason. So I think Jesus is a good answer. I think truth of the gospel is definitely a true answer, and it was probably meant to be both. I do think that the integrity part is important, and here's my rationale. So one of the most overlooked talking about modern weapons culture right now, one of the most overlooked piece of gear in shooting is the belt. I got advice from somebody when I was getting into shooting to get a really good belt. I was in college, I was a freshman at the time. I'm like, okay, so like a $20 belt? And they're like, no, like a $90 belt. I was like, I just need to hold my pants, man. But when you start hanging weapons off your belt and having your belt hold the rest of your gear together, it does actually need to be really high quality. Because all it takes is when you're fighting for your life, if you reach for something and it's not there, I would imagine it's a pretty bad feeling, because I know it's a bad feeling to be on the clock for a prize and to reach for something and have it not be there because I bought a crappy belt. I actually wound up beating one of the better shooters in the country on one stage last year because his belt fell apart because he was too cheap to buy a good belt. Halfway through a stage, it cost him 10 seconds. So the if you look back at what the belt was originally intended for during this time, very similar thing. It's to hold the weapons, hold his sidearm, which is gladius, his sword, and hold everything else together. You wanted everything in the same place so that when you are in the push of battle, you don't lose anything. So how these battle lines would work is you get multiple guys in a row, and then you would push forward towards the enemy or stand and hold the enemy back. You'd have guys on either side of you push shoulder to shoulder with you, and you'd have people behind you. And then, depending upon who was running the strategy, you'd have people, 8 to 10 to 20 people deep behind you. And the enemy would too. You push up against each other, and everybody's pushing and shoving and stabbing right there. There's a lot of getting jostled around, a lot of going back and forth. And if you don't have a good belt, you will your armor will start to come apart, and you'll have gaps in your armor. And you could very easily lose your weapons. So, much like in the modern kind of combatives community, a good belt was incredibly important back then. So why do I say this relates well to integrity? Because without integrity, everything falls apart.
Have you been reading Jordan Peterson like your Facebook would have me believe?
I have been. but I think integrity and truth is the kind of thing that holds everything together, right? So integrity is basically being consistent with your beliefs. And if we aren't living out our beliefs, if we're making compromises, we're essentially buying a cheap belt, right? We're putting a $20 belt on and then marching off into combat. And the belt, sometimes I say, well, having a bad belt's never killed anyone. The belt itself is not going to kill you, but the belt not doing its job, the belt not being there, not holding everything together, everything else falls apart, and that will get you killed. That will cause problems for you. So I do think this relates well to integrity, because again, without integrity, everything falls apart. We see this with with the Catholic Church, and that was not a smug laugh. That's a sad one, a sardonic one. But we see this with Bill Hybels. We've seen this a lot of scandals in the church. Integrity is incredibly important. And again, what did I say earlier about the battle line? When you don't do your job, you put everyone else on that line at risk. So what do we see now in the church? A lot of people who are outside the church are looking at the church going, man, they're all a bunch of hypocrites. They don't have any integrity, because a few people or several people on our, who were allegedly on our side in the struggle with us, made compromises integrity, and it's affecting the work of all of us. And you can say it's not just their fault; it's also the fault of the people over them who are supposed to hold them accountable, right? And that's true, but it affects everybody. Being killed is kind of a problem, Kessa. Indeed. Any other comments on the belt of truth before we move on? What? Breastplate of righteousness. So you guys,
sorry,
go ahead.
I was trying to remember my comment on that. I think it's interesting that like a lot of like farmers like 1200 years ago, they would have like prayer beads on their belt, as like they were literally wearing like a belt of truth, because like prayer helps you maintain that integrity in your life. So they literally had a belt of truth that they wore. Some of them, at least.
That's awesome.
That is all I had to say.
All right. The breastplate of righteousness. So you guys have probably seen Roman armor. The type that was in use, it went through several different stages. The type that was in use at the time was overlapping sheets of metal that kind of looked like scales almost. That's what would be referenced here. What's being referred to by the breastplate of righteousness? Is this good deeds? Is it the fact that we're justified? Is it something else? Go ahead, Kess.
I think. Oh, Guess
Go
go
ahead.
first.
I can wait.
I think if we assume this is all written at once, so it's probably all related. So based on the integrity explanation earlier, I think it would be not doing bad things specifically, because it's sort of the same type of everything comes apart if you're like it's almost dependent on integrity. Righteousness is, so that I wouldn't say it's because you're in right standing with God. I would say it's a specific warning against like doing bad things and making yourself vulnerable.
Good thought. Go ahead, Kess.
Actually, would say from my own experiences, and I don't know that this is all that it is, but being mindful of the fact that God does love us fully all the time, and as I've seen it put, we're lovable all the time because God loves us, and it's because of Jesus's righteousness, and also because He's our Creator Father. And if I don't keep that in mind, I'm open to so many other problems, including lack of integrity, because if nobody could love me because I'm not lovable, because God doesn't love me, then I have a lot of motivation for doing things unethically, shall we say.
Yeah, good point. Anybody else? Since there's only like 5 of us tonight, no need to raise hands. Just interject. All right, no, I think that both good thoughts. I do think that is this the righteousness God gives us through justification, or is this our own doing good deeds thing is kind of a trick question. Because we talked about in Ephesians and Romans how the deeds that we do are enabled by Christ, right? We're saved to good deeds. So it is kind of a both and thing. The other thing I would point out is Josh pointed out, Priest of Ekron pointed this out correctly. It's related to integrity. That's why it comes right afterwards. And again, the belt is something that would hold this together. So when we do good deeds, we are living out our identity and having integrity. It's related. One other thing I'd point out, this is also a reference back to a verse in Isaiah. Isaiah 59:17, talking about the Lord. He put on righteousness as a breastplate and a helmet of salvation on his head. He put on garments of vengeance for clothing and wrapped himself in zeal as a cloak. Talking about how God's going to come fight for his people. What's interesting, again, going back to the post-Marius reforms Roman military, those the armor that God uses, he has now issued out to us as well. So we get to take part in this struggle as privilege because of the sacrifice of our commander. So some of that's relating back to that verse in Isaiah as well. And I clicked off of Ephesians. Okay, there we're back. We're back. Okay. All right. Verse 15. And as shoes for your feet, having put on the readiness given by the gospel of peace. All right. What's being talked about in the shoes example here? What truth are we referring to?
Jesus.
Jesus is Lord.
Such safe answers.
Well, personally, if this, I've heard this before, and it kind of rings true. It sounds like that passage that says, "How beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news." I feel like there's a pretty strong correlation between those two. Gospel actually meaning good news.
Yeah, a lot of people, a lot of commentaries pull out that comparison.
He says it like he doesn't like it.
No, I think there's some truth there for sure. It's definitely related. Kess kind of saying the same thing exactly. But is the gospel being referred to as our shoes / sandals?
Fine, it says ready.
No.
Hey, you got a straight answer on somebody. Yes.
The gospel, it seems like the gospel is the commander that issues this, or maybe it's something. The readiness is a subset, and the shoes are a subset of the gospel.
Yeah. So, what's the allegory then?
What you can and can't walk on when you don't have your shoes on. Certain things are just off limits if you're barefoot, because you'll just get cuts and injuries, and it'll just be unfun for your whole team.
Yeah, in fact, the Romans were actually pretty good at this. Whenever they were facing certain enemies, like enemies that used chariots, they would actually strew the field with these little tiny spikes. They kind of look like tank traps, but they got they're like the James Bond things that fall out the back of his car, where no matter what way they fall, there's always one spike sticking up towards the sky, like 2 inches across, but just enough to really screw up a horse if it comes running across the field. So yeah, footing is obviously yeah, caltrops, exactly. So there's lots of different ways of reading this. Perhaps it's a willingness to travel to share the gospel. A lot of people think that. Perhaps it is the readiness by the gospel. So because we know the gospel, that makes us understand that we need to be ready. That puts us on a sort of quote unquote war footing, if you will. Where we've talked about how a lot of it's all about shoving, and kind of almost like a pushing match between the two armies. Obviously, good footing is needed to maintain traction. If somebody was caught off balance, they'd be bowled over and killed. As soon as you lose your footing, you're pretty much done. So the readiness from the gospel then makes us understand that we need to be ready at all times to share the gospel, to spread peace to those around us, to serve those around us, and understand that we're not here for a vacation. We're here to serve. We're here to serve God and to help those around us. I'm good with that illustration. It's also possible that we're all just reading way too far into this, and it's some combination of both. The willingness to share the gospel on that. I do think it's important to note that the gospel of peace here, again, indicating that these are metaphors. So we're not supposed to actually go over with a shield, shove people to the ground, and then stab them in the face for Jesus. Unless you're serving in the Roman military, that's what your commander tells you to do. Then maybe that is what
You
you're
mean
supposed
the Holy Roman military?
to do. Yeah, neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. Okay. Oh boy, yeah, losing control of the chat. Okay, so so there's pick your. I almost said pick your interpretation. Don't do that, but it's probably some combination of the two. But I do think the readiness part is important, just based upon how so much about of combat time was about footing. Anything else on that before we move on to the next piece of equipment? True. So the shoes that they would wear actually were open-toed, so you could use your toes for traction. But they're kind of like cleats. A lot of the soldiers would actually stick spikes to the bottom of them, little steel nails and stuff. The shooting, the shoe that is absolutely synonymous with competition shooting is the Solomons. Solomon Speedcross! I don't have them, but pretty much all of my shooting friends do. But again, it has like the little spikes built to the bottom of them for the same reasons you can have good footing. Roman vibro. Yeah, exactly. So carrying on the readiness example, in all circumstances, take up the shield of faith, with which you can extinguish all the flaming darts of the evil one. There you go, Bob. Well done. Shield of faith. So, what's a shield? Is it a defensive weapon or an offensive weapon?
Both.
You guys are great with the trick questions tonight. Yeah. So almost every other study or sermon I've heard preached on this passage, everybody's like, the shield is a defensive weapon. It's like, no. Like the sword is the only offensive piece of equipment here. No. So the let's just get that out of our heads. So the Roman shield, called a scutum, in Latin, it went from about your shins up to your neck or your eyes. So super broad coverage. It was very much not just a defensive weapon. Pretty much any history textbook you read will talk about how the shield was seen as an offensive weapon for both bashing. It was there you go, Bob. Wow, with the memes. It was used for bashing. It was not used for throwing like Captain America's shield. But what you would do is you would charge into the enemy with the guys at your back and at your they pushing you along. You'd be pushing along with the guys next to you. You'd impact the enemy, and ideally, in that crush when the two armies impacted, because the Romans were usually stronger and more disciplined, they'd use their shields to pin the enemy's weapons up against them, and then they'd light into them with the sword like a sewing machine, and just stab him, a dozen, 2 dozen times till that guy collapsed. And then you'd keep going. It's like a sewing machine all the way through the enemy line. But in order to do that, you had to be really aggressive with that shield, kind of crush the enemy with it as you were stabbing them. They had a big iron kind of reverse bowl in the middle of it for most of the shields. If the lines started breaking up and maybe you went into more of a skirmish line where you're more fighting one-on-one, you would use that to bash into the enemy's face or head and try to kill them that way too. So the shield was definitely an offensive thing. Why do I say that and make a big deal about that? Well, we'll talk about that in a minute. But what is mentioned here is how the shield is used to extinguish the flaming darts of the evil one. And this was also a very common Roman military tactic called testudo. Anybody who's played Rome Total War or Rome Total War 2 or Attila Total War knows what this is. It's when you interlock the edge of the shields with the people next to you, and the people behind you put their shields over you. And basically it creates a multi-person tank of a formation. So if the enemy is launching arrows at you, a lot of times they would dip the arrows in tar. You're protected from them because they can't get through the shield testudo.
Wasn't it the Greeks that started doing that?
That was the
Or is
phalanx. Yeah.
Okay.
Similar sort of thing with the phalanx. Yep. Yeah, the Romans were actually more effective at it because their shields were a little better. There you go. Exactly. Just like that. There were ways to break up a testudo, but you had to be kind of tricky about it. It was incredibly effective against extinguishing projectiles. And what you do is you testudo as you were advancing, or as the enemy's advancing on you. So if you're just holding a patch of dirt waiting for them to come, a lot of times their light troops would hit you with arrows and projectiles right before you got hit, trying to break up your line to create cracks for the enemy to come through. And so what they do is a testudo prevent that, and then as soon as the enemy impacted, they break out of the testudo and start pushing. I keep getting distracted by Captain America around the shield. Okay, so that's way more military knowledge than you guys needed, I'm sure. But the idea is here that the enemy is throwing flaming darts at us in the form of temptations or trials or what have you. Our faith can get us through that, right? It can help protect us from being taken out of the fight by those things. We can endure the temptations because of our faith. How does faith help us endure temptation?
By keeping a right picture of God's motives, for one thing.
Yeah. Very true. That was the problem in the garden, right? God doesn't want you to eat from this because he's jealous. He doesn't want you to be like him. That's not the case. God doesn't want you to eat from this because he wants to protect you. Hebrews Sprinkles says Hebrews 12:11, which for those of you who aren't turning there, says, "For the moment all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it." It's talking about God's discipline, but again, talking about God's motives there. Cass was saying, good. Yeah, exactly, Bob. And Cass. Yeah, you guys have it. Good.
I also just realized, like, holding up something like that is not easy. Like holding on to your faith is like, it's gonna be a workout. Like, it's gonna be exercise. So like, I think that's probably part of what was there, is like holding on to a shield and holding on to your faith all day for just one day is hard enough. Like, Like you carry around a shield like that at work and just tell me how difficult your day was. But I think that's part of it, is that it's not easy to hold on to it. Like a lot of the other stuff, I feel like almost everything by comparison is much easier to handle than the shield of faith. I don't know to what degree that was intentional and to what degree it wasn't, but go ahead and fill us in, Bible study leader.
No, not being there when this is written, I'm not sure how much of it was intentional or not, but the analogy certainly does hold, right? It takes effort, it takes willpower to trust in God's promises and to have faith. So C.S. Lewis talks about how faith is making the decision to trust what we knew before the crisis, right? So, like, a lot of times we don't fall apart, our faith doesn't fall apart because of intellectual doubts. It falls apart because of crises, struggles, temptation. And we need to remember that holding on to faith isn't holding on to something illogical. It's holding on something beyond logic. It's holding on to what we knew was true before we encountered this temptation, but now, and not giving up on it just because we want to do something else. It does take effort. It is difficult, but that's why we're supposed to do it in all circumstances. That's why it comes after the readiness piece. Take the shield to McDonald's. Yeah. The reason why I made it such a big deal about why it's an offensive piece of equipment, not just a defensive, is that it's not just used to withstand temptation. This is also needed to actively do our jobs. Our jobs are what? Love God, love people. So whatever that takes, whatever form that takes, that means that we need faith in order to do those things. We're going to be given another job here in a little bit in verse 18, which is praying. We need faith to pray as well. So this is needed. It's necessary for us to advance, not just hold our ground, but to advance the kingdom, to go on the attack. We need faith in order to do that. We need faith in order to give to church. We need faith in order to pray for our friends. We need faith in order to give our time to support people, and money to support people who are in need around us. We need faith to do those things. If we're using our faith just to withstand temptation, even though it's necessary for that, those darts are going to cut you to shreds if you don't have faith. The shield of faith. Even though it's necessary for that, if we're using it just for that, we're failing. The Romans understood that. They understood that the shield is there for both offense and defense. Again, that's why even the ancient Greeks, who had the phalanx warfare, which is kind of a more primitive version of the Roman conflict, or the Roman way of war, that's why the Spartans told their men, come back with your shield or on it. The sword protects you. The shield protects the other people on the battle line around you. You can't do your job as a soldier without that shield. And it is heavy and awkward, and it was the first thing that people would ditch when they ran from the battle, too. There's a hilarious Greek hymn it's called A Hymn to a Shield. You can look up the lyrics. Basically, they talk about how the shield was a great shield. He used to have this awesome shield, but he ditched it when he ran, and he'll find a different shield. It's okay. He got away. So it was the first thing, because it was so heavy and awkward, that you ditch whenever you ran. Because it takes effort to wield.
What's the name of this hymn?
I think it's called A Hymn to the Shield. It was funny. We read it in high school, and then it's actually in the new Assassin's Creed Odyssey in the original Greek. I heard the tune. I'm like, this sounds familiar from something. And sure enough, it was the hymn that we read in high school. Went to a little bit of a different high school curriculum. So, yeah.
Can't imagine how that happened.
Yeah. Bob knows what it is. Bob's a Becca, too. Yep. No, that's a perfect example, Bob. Yep, of how you need faith to do the things that we're called to do. I'd call that faith on offense. All right. Anything else on the shield?
I never thought about the points you're making about a shield being a group tool, more so almost than an individual tool in this particular context. That never occurred to me before.
It's kind of funny how all of Ephesians plays back into itself. Because we were talking about how we are many members of one body, and even when you come back to this, we're soldiers, but soldiers never fight a war on their own. They all fight as part of an army, and how the Roman army in particular, which Paul was literally chained as he was writing this to a Roman soldier.
Yep,
He
exactly.
had a very first-hand view. He knew this armor well. And so as he's using this example, he's like, he just ties it back in. You don't live the Christian life on your own. It's really cool.
So one of the things that the Roman army was famous for was their training. They were, at the time, the best trained army in the world. They would drill oftentimes twice a day as part of their expectation. They drill with wooden armor and shields, and swords that were designed to be double the regular weight of the regular equipment, which would suck, by the way, because the regular scudum, the regular shield, 20 pounds. So, yeah, 40-pound piece of equipment now that you're holding on your arm for the drill. But they would drill in formation twice a day because it was so important that they knew how to work together as a group. The Roman historian who said that Roman practices were bloodless battles, and Roman battles were bloody drills. Because they knew how to work together, and it was that important for them to work together. Combat was not an individual exercise; it was a group activity. So, again, Paul knew that, right? Because he's chained to these guys, so he's seeing them drill every day, and that's why he's using those group verbs for us, because this is not an individual thing; something we all do together. All right. Helmet of salvation. So any PUBG players here know how important the helmet is.
And any Team Fortress 2 players really know how important it is.
Yeah.
Different reason, but yes.
Yeah. So obviously helmet's important, even in today's battles. It's the one thing that can take you out of a fight immediately, right? Would be a head wound. Great example, Bob. Yeah, that's what a Roman helmet looks like, actually. So the helmet of salvation protects us from being instantly removed from this, right? We know that we're protected from that one lethal blow. It's provided by our general, not something that we provided from ourselves. Also referencing the Isaiah passage on that. And pretty straightforward, I think, on this, but important. Finally, we have the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. So what's the sword of the Spirit? Not a trick question.
The Bible.
The chat is on point tonight, guys. Yeah, no.
Can,
Go ahead, Cass, sorry.
beg pardon. I can give an example, which I think I've used before, but I believe it's Proverbs 27:5. I still remember. There was a point in my life where I didn't know the Bible super well. I was in some, should I say, difficult circumstances, made worse by context. And I remember I flipped to this verse because back then I would read a proverb usually corresponding to the day. So it was the 27th of whatever month it was. And I remember I was sitting on the floor and it was King James, but it said, better is open rebuke than hidden love. Oh no, that's ESV. I read it in the King James originally. It's such a short verse, but it gave me the strength somehow to deal with a situation that had been going on for almost a decade at the time. And actually, my taking a stand on this made things worse in a way, but healthier. And it would not have been possible if I hadn't seen that verse. It was a turning point in my life.
Interesting. Yeah, no, I can point to similar stories in my own life, and I think probably a lot of us here can. Because I think we understand the power of the Bible, right? Of the sword of the Spirit here. This is the word of God.
Dunamis.
Yeah. Thank you. Tying it all together. Good job. So I'll give you guys a little bit of history background because that's my meme. This is the only time that I am aware of where the sword was the primary weapon of a military in history. Now, somebody's probably going to pull out, well, there was this time of this tribe of Africa. Okay, yeah. This is the only time that I'm aware of where it was the sword of where it was the primary weapon of a large military in history. The sword reference would be the gladius. It's a relatively short sword. A lot of you guys would look at it and be like, that's more of a knife. It's 24 to 33 inches long, depending upon...
That's a knife.
Thank you. You got the reference. 24 to 33 inches long, depending upon the general that's issuing them, the era that the theater they're in, the era that they're in. But it was primarily a stabbing weapon. The Romans were one of the huge things they would drill on was stabbing with the gladius. So that is a gladius. It's a little bit of a Xephos cut on that blade right there, where it curves in and out. That's more of a Greek style cut. The gladius would be traditionally straight edged. The Xephos like that is more of a hacking weapon, which is great for that. There you go. That's the gladius. But the straighter edges give you better surface for stabbing, and the Romans were big into stabbing. You'd actually get beat if you were caught cutting outside of having like a reason to. There were specific reasons that they could cut, but for the most part, it was like I said, you'd push up in with the shield, and you'd go to town like a sewing machine with the stabbing. And they'd practice on dummy targets for hours on this, because the human tendency is to slash for whatever reason. It's like logical studies on it. But the most biomechanically efficient way of doing things is stabbing. Now, why do I... Other than the fact that it's... Exactly, guys. Take note, Wingen. Take note. Why talk about that? Well, because there are there's takeaways actually from that to this for theology, I think, about the application on it. And one of the first persons who I saw make this connection was Lady Iger. She came home one day after doing a study on this with her women's group, and she goes, "Hey, did you know that the Roman gladius was a stabbing weapon, not a hacking weapon?" And that, of course, like launched me into a military lecture on period tactics, basically confirming what she said. After her eyes got done glazing over, I said, "Yeah, I did know that." It became my explanation. And I go, "Why?" why? And she goes, because the women's group, they're talking about how when we are going to be applying the word of God, most of the time we're not applying huge things. It's not the artillery of the Spirit.
What?
But it is instead a short, applicable part of the word that applies exactly to what we're going through, or exactly to what we're dealing with, what we're facing temptation-wise, or what we need to do. And I went, huh. Well, that's a little bit embarrassing after just launching off on a lecture of period-specific military tactics. but it makes some sense, right? I mean, if thinking back on the times where I've needed to be brave in my life, if somebody said to me, read the book of Ephesians or read the book of Romans and gave me a sermon, that wouldn't stick with me. What stuck with me was stumbling across Joshua 1:9 and pondering that one thing, how it applied exactly to my circumstance and what the ramifications of that were. So what that means is a lot of times we don't need I'm getting to you, priest. Hang on. What it means is we don't need a whole, we don't need to sermonize ourselves or sermonize our friends or read off a whole sermon to ourselves to deal with whatever we're dealing with. A lot of times it's just one verse that applies really well, or one piece of this, and thinking about that, or using that, and how that or obeying that will deal with our situation. Go ahead, priest. Sorry.
Well, I was wondering if anyone's ever heard of the term arrow prayers.
I've heard them called flare prayers.
Well, I know that was what the name they coined for it, like 1700 years ago. That was the idea, was like half sentence prayers for when you are in need, to pray that prayer just once and continue going about your day. So it's very similar to like a stabbing motion, because it's not like an hour and a half prayer meeting. It's just help me to meditate on things that are pure and lovely, and like that's the end of the prayer. It's very stabby, a very short, efficient prayer.
Hold on to that thought, because we're going to circle back on that.
Woo.
With the next set of verses. Anything else on the sword of the Spirit before we move on? Since we're way over time. Get on with talking about military history and you go over time. Unsurprised.
Hey, you're only 5 minutes over right now.
And you waited up for us. So, what you guys were saying about very specific context for the word to be applied in, Horancia, the passage where it says the sword is sharper. The word of God is sharper than any two-edged sword, and all the things it can cut apart, discerning the thoughts and intents of the heart. That's all.
No, it's a good point. You think about when Jesus would talk to people, very rarely did he launch off on a sermon. It was always something very short, to the point, and convicting, right?
I think we only have like one real sermon from Jesus, if I'm remembering right. Everything else was just like a paragraph.
Yeah, it's true. His enemies hated him because of it too, right? They always understood. They always understood he was taking shots at them with the one or two sentences he would say to them. All right, good. So that's the equipment. You guys can see how it all kind of is related. It all kind of builds upon itself, and how it all relates to the group, right? Good. Okay. I'm assuming silence is consent.
Yes.
Okay. Good. Okay. All right. Verse 18 seems to go off in a different direction. Praying at all times in the Spirit with all prayer and supplication. To that end, keep alert with all perseverance. Make a supplication for all the saints, and also for me, that words may be given to me in opening my mouth boldly to proclaim the mystery of the gospel, for which I am an ambassador in chains, that I may declare it boldly as I ought to speak. Okay. So without switching sentences, we roll right into this thing on prayer. What's going on there? Is this like an additional piece of equipment? Is this something totally different? As Paul is kind of having ADHD? What's going on with this? Why are we rolling right from all this military equipment metaphors right into prayer?
I have heard it both ways personally, so I would like to hear your thoughts.
I will ask the questions here.
I never made a question. I made a statement.
It sounds a lot like he's outlining how you do a drill, and he's like, make sure you get all of your stuff together for you, and then do the stabby things. That's what it sounds like. It's now that you have this stuff, this is what you do with it.
Interesting, yeah. For sure could be that. Anybody else?
I don't think anything that's been advised up till now can be done without prayer.
Exactly. I've only been.
Good, yeah. Wingy, do you want to give an answer before I give my answer?
No, I'm really just more interested in what everybody else is having to say right now.
By the way, Josh, that is exactly what I'm saying when I say that.
Oh yeah, that's like the most Bible study leader thing ever. Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, maybe.
Oh, that's a really good idea.
One of the Bible study leaders, when I started 12 years ago, people would give answers he didn't like, he'd go, like a non-committal.
If no word is used and it's just a grunt, then that's not what he wrote down.
So I think, first of all, anybody else? Bob started typing and then stopped typing. You can just speak, Bob.
It is not the way of the Bob.
No, it's not. I don't think I've ever heard him speak, actually.
He does have a voice. Or, on occasion, I guess that's more, there is a voice that has come through. Whether or not it's him is, I have no.
It's a bold claim there. Bold claims. To wing it, not to you.
Is it really? Is it really a bold claim?
Not everybody has a voice.
Yeah, but like to say he doesn't have a voice, that would be a bold claim.
Okay. Well,
Andres has 2 arms. That's not a bold claim.
okay, I'm not going to rabbit trail that with you any further. So
well, the bait was real.
It was real. Nice guys. Yes. So I think you guys are all tracking down the right path here. There are lots of different ways of reading this. Some people have claimed that this is kind of like the arrows, which is the notable missing piece of equipment. The Romans had a phylum, kind of a light spear that they would chuck at their enemy right before they made contact. The phylum would run into the enemy's shield and would deliberately break. It was built in. There was one of the one of the nails used to build it was wood, so when it hit the enemy shield, it would shiv, break off at a weird angle, and the enemy would be like, "What the heck?" and start trying to disentangle this thing from his shield before the lines made contact. Nobody needed to know that on Earth. I know. So that's the piece that the Romans will also be issued that's missing here. So people are like, okay, the prayer is kind of like the ranged support, the arrows of the army. So maybe I don't know. That seems like a bit of a stretch to me, as much as I do like drawing conclusions from from the context. However, I think that a better interpretation is what you guys have here, which is the prayer is both part of what we're told to do with this equipment, rolls immediately from that into an imperative, praying at all times in the Spirit with prayer and supplication. That and keep alert with all perseverance, making supplication. So it's part of that alertness, part of that readiness, part of that war footing that we talked about. It also enables us to do our mission. Talk about what the mission is. It's been laid out specifically in chapter 5 and 4, how that works out in community with one another. That's part of our mission. All of these things as equipment is for that. So the prayer is both something that enables that, and it's part of the mission as well, because it's here as a command, as an imperative in the Greek. So this is part of waging that struggle. Part of it is prayer. It's every bit as important as the equipment. It's mentioned in the list and given as a command. So it is part of that waging the struggle thing that the priest is talking about. That's something that I need to be better at. I gotta be honest with you guys. I spend a lot of time trying to figure out how I'm gonna do things and neglect the prayer part of things. Prayer for strength, prayer for guidance, prayer for healing, those sorts of things, because I figure I'll do it myself, and what I won't do, God will provide. And what I forget is that this is part of that mission, and I'm neglecting my part of the struggle when I do that. And again, what happens when I don't do my job in this sort of combat?
Your friend gets stabbed.
Pretty much. Yep. I don't just put myself at risk. I put other people at risk. I put you guys at risk when I do that. So that's how important prayer is. You're not just putting yourself at risk, but you're putting others at risk as well. So what? What will we do with this week?
Well, I have a question that I said when we get to verse 18. I have a question.
Okay.
Who are the saints?
That would be all of us.
Okay.
Yep.
Cool. So would it be good to interpret it? Pray for everyone, but especially for like leaders? Am I reading too much into it or what?
No, you're fine with that.
Okay.
We're told to pray for leaders elsewhere. I would say in this right here, it's talking about praying for everyone, especially other believers. But
Okay.
yeah. Well, it also says for me, and also for me. So yes, also for leaders.
Cool. That's what I thought.
Don't pray for the New Orleans Saints though, or do what you want. I'm not your boss.
I'm just going to make a blanket suggestion and say don't pray about sports outcomes.
That's a whole different discussion. But yeah, I mean, I'm not. When I say but yeah, that's a moving on comment, not a agreeing comment. Just to be clear, people who are like, does Onger think we should pray about sports things? Totally different discussion.
That's totally a discussion we need to have, though.
It is an interesting discussion,
Yes, we do.
But we're already a half an hour over because military history. Pontificating. Good question, though. Anything else on this?
Pontificating. Excellent Roman usage.
I'm trying to be less hateful towards Roman culture. And that's
Okay.
biased towards Greek. So,
I mean, I'm biased towards Greek. Just the Romans were jerks.
kind of thugs. Anyway,
Yeah, kind of.
not a big fan of the foreign policy, but anyway, this is my libertarian getting in the way. So what do we do with this week? How do we live this out? Do we go out and buy ourselves a gladius? More importantly, do we go out and buy Angert the gladius for Christmas?
No, we buy ourselves a good quality belt.
By the way, guys, even if you want to get him a gladius, you still got like 363 days for it. So
What are you talking about? It's the third day of Christmas. You have 9 days.
Get after that. So buying a quality belt would be a good takeaway, if that's what you get from this. However, that's not the only takeaway I was going for you for. By the way, I still have
yeah,
that belt I bought.
Be mindful that other people need your prayers, and to be effective in your prayers, you need to not be backsliding.
Now that's interesting, isn't it? What we do affects our prayer life. Good point.
Yeah, I agree with that. Or I said the praying has made a huge difference. It hasn't made like so much of a difference for me, as near as I can tell. It's like people just like, hey, I've noticed XYZ thing has been doing a lot better in my life. And I'm like, I didn't tell you I was praying. Like, this is actually something that's happening. Like, it seems to be the prayers of other people, like praying for other people is the more important part of praying.
It's certainly the part that is highlighted here. Yeah. And that shouldn't surprise us. I mean, the Lord's Prayer, the pronouns used are all group pronouns, right? Prayer is a community event too. Even when we pray individually. Go ahead, Winged.
and while I agree with the whole idea of prayer making a difference in other person's life, I think it's important to note that prayer is also very important in your own life because, well, praying for yourself is one thing, but for me personally, I know that it helps me to focus more, to focus my mind because it's so easy to get distracted. The more often I'm in prayer, the more it helps me to align with where a lot of the other, a lot of the ideals that we talked about earlier with the in the armor of the spirit, thinking about my faith and my salvation and what's true, and then oftentimes when you pray you just speak back the scriptures, and so that just brings about the idea of the sword. And so it's just to me, while I do it to support others, it also helps me to stay aligned with the armor and what I should be doing, and so it just kind of this very circular maintenance sort of idea.
Yeah, good point. Good point as well, Kessa.
Yeah, that wasn't in your notes either.
A lot of this stuff isn't, which is why this is a group activity as well. I learned from you guys as much as you learn from me. Probably more.
Well, that's not fair. You have like 6 of us helping you out. We only have one Unger.
I need all the help I can get. Yeah. No, it's a very good point. I think one thing that you guys are all kind of getting at is the interconnectedness of this, right? So prayer relating to our spiritual walk relating to back to prayer, so our ability to serve God, to help those around us, our relationship with the body of believers affecting our prayer life and affecting our walk. It's a Western tendency, something that we inherit from the Greeks, to dichotomize things. That's a big word. What does that mean? basically to separate things, to segment things. They used to segment things so that they could study it, kind of like dissecting a frog or what have you. You gotta be careful when we do that, though, that we don't start thinking that each of these things are their own thing, whether it be our relationship with, you know, the Christian community, um, or our prayer life, or our resistance to sin, or our working to serve those around us and to serve God. All these things are connected as part of the walk. It's all part of the struggle, right? And just like we talked about how the um, the individuals on the battle line affect the outcome, right? So what I'm doing, whether I'm holding my shield up or not, or whether I forgot to bring my shield or what have you, that affects cast, that affects winged, that affects football. Just like that affects the group, these individual things affect the rest of our walk as well. So a negligence of prayer affects my relationship with God, affects my relationship with the battle line, with the rest of you guys. So it's all connected. I think that's important to remember um, that because it's all connected, we can't do one thing and expect to be able to segment it. I can't go and um, allow sin into one area of my life and think I'm going to just keep it there. It's going to affect my integrity. It's going to affect my ability to serve God. It's going to affect you guys.
Yep,
So
because we're all members of God's body.
yeah, exactly. It's connected. So when we talk about these things individually, let's not forget that, because it can be dangerous to think that they're not connected. Good. Anything else? Thank you guys. Okay. Let's close out in prayer. Any closing prayer